I mocked a witch's bird at the market. Now it's on my roof, crowing with human teeth and my dead mother's voice. On today's episode of the Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell and stay with us, thank you. The market at Githurai was a chaotic symphony of modern survival, a place where the scent of roasting maize battled with the acrid fumes of idling madhattas and the metallic tang of blood from the open-air butcheries. Kariuki moved through the throng like a jagged glass shard, his oversized headphones draped around his neck as a signal of his chosen isolation. He was 17, possessing a face that had forgotten how to be young, hardened by the dusty winds of the Central Highlands and a domestic life that felt like a slow-motion car crash. Beside him, his younger sister Wanjiku hovered like a nervous moth, her hands clutching the straps of her school bag as she tried to avoid the puddles of gray water that gathered in the ruts of the red earth. They were there for kale and onions, but Kariuki was there to perform his daily ritual of superiority, a defense mechanism he used to convince himself that he was smarter, colder, and more untouchable than the desperate souls hawking plastic basins and second-hand shoes. When they reached the corner where the old woman known as Mama Shiro sat, a woman whose skin looked like the topographical map of a forgotten land, Kariuki found his target. She was cradling a chicken that looked more like a mistake of nature than a bird, a featherless, shivering thing with eyes that seemed to hold a terrifyingly lucid intelligence. Without thinking, driven by the restless cruelty that often masked his own emptiness, Kariuki let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the haggling of the nearby vegetable sellers. "Look at that, Wanjiku," he sneered, pointing a calloused finger at the trembling creature. "Old Shiro is trying to sell a dinosaur. Who would buy a bird that's already been plucked by the devil himself?" He expected the old woman to shrink, or perhaps to offer a toothless retort that he could easily bat it away with another witty jab. Instead, the market seemed to go unnaturally still, the roar of the engines and the shouting of the touts fading into a dull hum. Mama Shiro raised her head slowly, her milky eyes fixing on Kariuki with a gaze that felt like cold water running down his spine. She didn't scold him. She simply tightened her grip on the wretched bird, her lips curling into a smile that was devoid of any warmth. "You laugh because your heart is loud, boy," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle like wind through dead maize stalks. "But laughter is a debt that must always be paid in the currency of the night. You find beauty in mockery, so I will send you something beautiful to watch over your sleep." Kariuki felt a momentary prickle of sweat on his forehead, but he quickly masked it with another dismissive huff, dragging Wanjiku away as he tossed a final, mocking comment over his shoulder about the price of spirit-fried chicken. The night in their small, three-roomed house usually tasted like charcoal smoke and unsaid grievances. Kariuki lay on his thin mattress, the flickering light of a distant street lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked plaster of the walls. His father, Mwangi, was already snoring in the next room, a heavy, rhythmic sound that spoke of a man who worked 12 hours a day just to afford the luxury of forgetting his own name. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, a new sound began to vibrate through the structure of the house. It wasn't the usual scratching of rats or the groan of the settling foundation. It was a heavy, deliberate thudding on the corrugated iron sheets above his head, like someone was dropping wet bags of flour onto the roof. Kariuki sat up, his heart thudding against his ribs. He thought of the old woman in the market, the way her eyes had seemed to pierce through his bravado, and a sudden, irrational coldness settled in his gut. He tried to tell himself it was just a stray dog or a neighbor's goat that had somehow climbed the embankment, but then the crowing started. It wasn't the proud, sun-seeking clarion call of a rooster. It was a wet, clicking sound, punctuated by a series of sharp, metallic snaps that sounded like a man grinding his molars in a fevered dream. Creeping out of bed, Kariuki moved to the small window and peered out into the moonlit yard. The sight that met his eyes froze the breath in his lungs. Perched on the very peak of their roof was a silhouette that defied the laws of biology. It was the chicken from the market, but it had tripled in size, its featherless skin glowing with an unhealthy, pale luminescence under the Kenyan moon. As it threw its head back to crow again, the moonlight caught the inside of its beak. Kariuki didn't see the jagged, serrated edges of a bird's mouth. Instead, he saw two perfect rows of square, white human teeth, wet with saliva and gleaming with a predatory hunger. The bird turned its head 180 degrees, its gaze locking onto Kariuki through the glass. It didn't attack. It simply smiled, a wide, grotesque expression that stretched its leathery skin to the breaking point. In that moment, the mockery that Kariuki had worn like armor for years shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. He realized that the creature wasn't just on his roof. It was a manifestation of the very air in their house, a physical weight that had been invited in by his own arrogance. He backed away from the window, his knees hitting the floor, as the sound of the clicking teeth began to harmonize with the rhythmic breathing of his sleeping family, weaving a nightmare into the very fabric of their home. The dawn didn't bring the usual relief of sunlight. Instead, it revealed the grotesque reality of the creature perched atop their home. Kariuki watched from the shadows of the doorway as the neighborhood began to stir, the sound of charcoal stoves being lit, and the distant calling of water vendors creating a facade of normalcy that felt increasingly fragile. The chicken remained, its skin a bruised purple-gray, pulsing with a life force that seemed to draw the very heat out of the morning air. Every time it shifted its weight, the corrugated iron groaned under a mass that shouldn't belong to a bird. When Kariuki finally gathered the courage to step into the yard, the bird leaned down, its neck elongating with a sickening, fluid grace. It didn't squawk. It parted its beak to reveal those hauntingly familiar human teeth, rows of ivory that looked like they had been stolen from a graveyard. The creature's eyes were not the vacant beads of a bird, but were deep, swirling pools of amber that seemed to reflect Kariuki's own terrified expression back at him. It was a smile that wasn't a smile, a baring of teeth that signaled a predatory patience, as if the bird was waiting for a fruit to ripen before it decided to feast. The boy felt a cold sweat break across his neck, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just a curse of optics. It was a physical manifestation of every cruel word he had ever uttered, a mirror held up to his own soul. As the day progressed, the psychological weight of the bird's presence began to erode the family's already thin veneer of stability. Mwangi, their father, left for work with his head bowed, refusing to look up at the roof, his footsteps heavy and dragging as if he were walking through deep mud. He didn't ask about the sound that had kept them awake. In the silence of their home, nomming a monster was the same as inviting it to the table. Kariuki tried to distract himself with chores, but every time he swung the panga to clear the overgrowth near the fence, the rhythm of the blade seemed to sync with the clicking of the bird's teeth. He felt the eyes of the neighbors on him, the suspicious glances of the women at the communal tap, and the hushed whispers of the old men playing draughts under the acacia tree. They saw the bird, but they didn't see the teeth. To them, it was a bad omen, a sign of a house out of balance, but to Kariuki, it was a personal jailer. The atmosphere in the township grew thick and stagnant, the usual vibrant energy of the street replaced by a mounting dread that seemed to radiate from their yellow-painted walls. By the time the sun began to dip behind the Aberdare ranges, Kariuki realized that the bird hadn't moved an inch. Yet it felt closer than ever, its shadow stretching across the dirt yard like a long, dark finger pointing directly at his heart. The fourth day arrived with a heavy, unnatural mist that clung to the red earth of the township, muffling the sounds of the waking world. Inside the house, the air felt recycled, heavy with the scent of old dust and something metallic, like the taste of a penny on the tongue. Wanjiku, usually a burst of chaotic energy and persistent questions, had become a ghost in her own home, moving with a cautious, tiptoeing gait that made Kariuki's skin crawl. She sat at the small wooden table, staring into her bowl of cold porridge, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. When Kariuki reached out to ruffle her hair, a rare gesture of affection he immediately regretted, she flinched violently, her spoon clattering to the floor. She looked up at him, and for a moment Kariuki saw a flicker of something ancient and terrified in his sister's gaze. "It spoke to me, Kari," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the low hum of the refrigerator. "The big bird on the roof. It didn't crow this morning when the sun came up. It leaned over the gutter while I was hanging the dishcloths, and it called me Shiku. It used the voice Mom used when she was happy, the one she only used when we were hidden in the blankets." Kariuki felt a surge of cold fury and gut-wrenching fear at her words, the mention of their mother's private nickname for her hitting him like a physical blow. Their mother had been dead for 5 years, her memory a sacred, jagged territory that they navigated with extreme caution, yet here was this monstrosity on their roof using her voice as a lure. He grabbed Wanjiku's shoulders, his grip tighter than he intended, searching her face for any sign that she was playing a cruel trick on him. "Don't you ever say that again," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and protective instinct. "It's a bird, Shiku. It's just a bird that some crazy old woman cursed because I was being a jerk. It doesn't have a voice, and it definitely doesn't have her voice." But even as the words left his mouth, he heard the click-clack of the teeth from above, a sound that seemed to mock his denial. Wanjiku didn't argue, she simply looked away, a single tear carving a path through the dust on her cheek. The bond of their shared silence, the lie they had lived since the funeral, that they were fine, and that the past was buried, was beginning to crack under the pressure of a chicken that knew too much, and Kariuki realized with a jolt of terror that the bird wasn't just haunting them, it was excavating them. By the 5th evening, the physical transformation of the creature had become impossible for the rest of the township to ignore, though they viewed it through the distorted lens of their own superstitions. It had doubled in size again, its wingspan now capable of draping over the eaves like a tattered, skin-colored cloak. The weight of it caused the wooden rafters of the house to groan and pop in the middle of the night, a sound like bones snapping under immense pressure. Neighbors would gather at a distance, pointing and making the sign of the cross, or throwing salt toward the gate to ward off whatever juju Kariuki's family had supposedly brought upon themselves. To the outsiders, it was a freak of nature, perhaps a mutation caused by the chemicals from the nearby flower farms, but to those inside the house, the bird's growth was a direct measurement of their mounting anxiety. It was feeding on the tension, swelling with every avoided gaze and every sharp word exchanged between Kariuki and his father. The bird's skin had begun to sprout strange, wiry bristles that looked more like human hair than feathers, and the smell it emitted had changed from a dry, avian scent to something sickeningly sweet, like lilies left too long in a vase at a wake. Kariuki spent hours packing the small perimeter of their yard, watching the creature with a morbid fascination that bordered on obsession. He noticed that the bird's chest heaved with a rhythmic pulse that matched his own heartbeat whenever he stood directly beneath it. It was as if a cord had been tied between his sternum and the monster's bloated crop. The township's electricity flickered and died as the sun went down, a common occurrence in the outskirts, leaving the house bathed in the eerie, bioluminescent glow of the bird's translucent skin. In the darkness, the creature seemed to merge with the architecture of the house itself, its long, clawed feet gripping the iron sheets so tightly that the metal began to warp and tear. Kariuki felt a sense of claustrophobia closing in, a feeling that the walls of the house were shrinking while the bird was expanding, eventually intending to squeeze the life out of them all. He looked at his father, who was sitting in the corner with an unlit cigarette, staring at nothing, and realized that the growth wasn't just happening on the roof. The silence between them had grown just as large, just as heavy, and just as grotesque, a living entity that was now too big to be ignored or pushed aside. The 6th morning didn't begin with a crow, but with a dull, wet thud that echoed through the kitchen. Kariuki found it near the back door, an egg the size of a football, but its shell wasn't the smooth, calcium white of a normal bird's. Instead, it was mottled and leathery, pulsing slightly as if there were a heart beating inside it. The surface was translucent in patches, revealing dark, swirling fluids and solid shapes that shifted whenever Kariuki moved closer. Wanjiku and Mwangi gathered around it, the three of them forming a circle of dread in the dim morning light. No one wanted to touch it, but the object held a magnetic pull, a gravity that seemed to demand acknowledgement. Finally, using a tea towel to protect his hands, Kariuki lifted the heavy, warm mass. It didn't feel like an egg. It felt like an organ, heavy and wet. As he placed it on the kitchen table, the leathery skin began to tear of its own accord, not shattering like a shell but unzipping with a soft, organic sound. A thick, clear ichor spilled across the wood, smelling of old rain and rosemary, and as the fluid cleared, a glint of gold caught the light. Nestled in the center of the ruptured sack was a gold wedding band, its surface scratched but unmistakable. Mwangi let out a strangled gasp, his hand flying to his throat as if he were choking on his own breath. It was the ring he had buried with their mother 5 years ago, or so Kariuki had thought. The boy remembered the funeral, the way his father had stood over the open grave, his face a mask of stone, refusing to shed a single tear even as the earth began to cover the casket. The appearance of the ring was a physical impossibility, a violation of the sanctity of the grave. Yet there it was, sitting on their kitchen table, dripping with the bird's unnatural fluids. The bird on the roof let out a low, vibrating hum that shook the floorboards, a sound of smug satisfaction. It was the first gift, a piece of the past regurgitated into the present, forcing them to look at a symbol of a union that had ended in a tragedy they still refused to discuss. Mwangi reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the gold, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a subpoena, a demand from the darkness to account for the secrets they had tried to lock away in the red soil of the highlands. After the discovery of the ring, a profound and heavy lethargy settled over Mwangi, a state that Kariuki could only describe as the weight of iron. His father, a man who had always defined himself by his physical strength, and his ability to endure the back-breaking labor of the construction sites, seemed to physically shrink. He stopped going to work, sitting instead on the sagging sofa in the living room, staring at the wedding band which he had eventually placed in a saucer on the coffee table. He didn't eat, didn't drink, and barely seemed to breathe, his eyes fixed on the gold as if he were trying to read a message written in its scratches. The bird on the roof seemed to respond to this collapse by becoming even heavier. The iron sheets above the living room began to sag visibly, the center of the ceiling bowing downward like a pregnant belly. Every groan of the timber felt like a countdown, a reminder that their sanctuary was being slowly crushed by the gravity of their own unresolved grief. Kariuki felt a terrifying role reversal. He was now the one who had to find food, who had to comfort Wanjiku, and who had to face the monster that his own laughter had summoned. The psychological atmosphere of the house became so thick that it felt like walking through water. Kariuki tried to talk to his father to shake him out of his stupor, but Mwangi's voice, when it came, was a hollow echo of its former self. "The earth doesn't give back what it takes, Kariuki," he whispered one evening, his eyes never leaving the ring. "If that bird brought this back, it means the ground is no longer holding her. It means the things I said to her that night. They're not buried anymore. They're up there on the roof, clicking their teeth." Kariuki felt a chill that no amount of tea could warm. He realized that the curse wasn't just about the bird. It was about the dissolution of the barriers between the living and the dead, the spoken and the unspoken. The house was no longer a home. It was a courtroom where the evidence was being presented piece by piece. He looked at the ceiling, seeing the rust-stained iron bending under the bird's weight, and realized that if they didn't do something soon, the roof wouldn't just collapse. It would swallow them whole, dragging them down into the same dark silence that the bird was now systematically excavating. On the 8th night, the bird changed its tune. The clicking of the teeth remained, but it began to incorporate the sounds of the township into its nocturnal performance. It wasn't just crowing, it was broadcasting. From the roof, the family heard the muffled arguments of the couple 3 houses down, the secret whispers of the local drunkard confessing his sins to a stray dog, and the sharp, jagged laughter of the teenage girls at the bus stop. It was as if the bird had become a lightning rod for all the hidden frequencies of the community, a grotesque radio tower that played back the hidden shames of Githurai. But as the clock struck 2, the mimicry turned inward. The bird began to play back sounds from within their own walls, the sound of Kariuki's mother humming while she braided Wanjiku's hair, the sound of a shattering glass from 5 years ago, and the low, urgent murmur of a final argument. The house became a sonic hall of mirrors, every corner echoing with a different fragment of a life that had been violently interrupted. Kariuki covered his ears, but the sound seemed to vibrate through his very bones, a symphony of should-haves and if-onlys. The community's reaction shifted from curiosity to a sharp, defensive hostility. It is one thing to have a cursed bird in the neighborhood. It is another to have that bird broadcast your secrets for all to hear. People began to gather at the edge of the property, not with curiosity, but with stones and sticks. They didn't see the teeth or the ring, but they felt the exposure, the way the bird's unnatural voice stripped away their privacy. A stone shattered the front window, showering the living room in glass, but Mwangi didn't even flinch. Kariuki stood at the broken window, looking out at the angry faces of people he had known his whole life, and realized that they were more afraid of the truth than they were of the monster. The bird on the roof let out a sound that was a perfect replica of Kariuki's own mocking laugh from the market, the laugh that had started it all. But now it sounded hollow, amplified, and laden with a biting irony. He understood then that the bird wasn't just a punishment for him. It was a mirror for the entire town's hypocrisy, fed by the very silence that he had used as a shield. The second crow wasn't a call to wake up. It was a call to account, and the price of the broadcast was the destruction of the family's last remaining ties to the world outside their gate. The rot began at the edges of the property and worked its way inward. The small garden, the shamba where their mother had once grown kale, spinach, and a few precious stalks of maize, began to wither in a way that defied the season. It wasn't a dry, yellowing death. The plants turned a deep, oily black, their leaves curling into charred husks as if they had been touched by a frost made of soot. Even the weeds, usually the most resilient survivors of the township, shriveled and died. The soil itself changed texture, becoming a fine gray ash that didn't hold water, blowing away in the slight breeze to coat the house in a layer of mourning. Kariuki watched from the porch as the life force of the land was systematically drained, drawn upward toward the roof where the monster sat. The bird was now so large that its tail feathers, if they could be called feathers, dragged in the dirt, leaving scorched furrows in the earth. It was no longer just a guest on their roof. It was a parasite that was consuming the very foundation of their survival, turning their small plot of land into a cemetery of vegetation. The death of the garden felt like the final erasure of their mother's touch. She had been the one to nurture the soil, her hands always stained with the red highland clay, finding life in a place that seemed designed for struggle. With the shamba gone, the house felt unanchored, a sinking ship in a sea of gray ash. Wanjiku tried to save a single rose bush their mother had planted near the door, pouring their precious drinking water onto its roots, but by morning the stems were as brittle as old bone. The bird watched her efforts with a tilted head, letting out a sound like a low, sympathetic coo that felt more insulting than a scream. Kariuki realized that the bird was creating a vacuum, a space where nothing could exist except the manifestation of their trauma. It was isolating them, stripping away the distractions of growth and labor until all that was left was the core of their family's dysfunction. The air in the yard became thin and difficult to breathe, the oxygen replaced by the sweet, cloying scent of the bird's decay and the dry taste of the ash. They were being prepared, Kariuki felt, for a feast, not a feast of flesh, but a feast of the spirit, where the main course would be the truth they had spent years trying to starve. On the 10th day, the bird laid the second egg. This one was smaller than the first, but it was a vibrant, bruised red, the color of a fresh wound. It didn't fall to the ground. It appeared on the kitchen table while they were sleeping, sitting in the center of the saucer where the wedding ring had been. When Kariuki found it, he felt a wave of nausea so strong he had to lean against the wall for support. He didn't wait for his father or sister this time. He grabbed a kitchen knife and sliced through the leathery skin with a desperate, shaky hand. Instead of the clear ichor of the first egg, a thick, dark red fluid that looked like menstrual blood spilled out, staining the white lace tablecloth their mother had cherished. Inside, tangled in the viscera of the egg, were the funeral beads, the traditional Kikuyu waist beads and the red glass necklace their mother had been wearing on the night of the accident. They were cold to the touch, and as Kariuki pulled them from the mess, he realized they weren't just jewelry. They were wet with the scent of the river where her car had been found. The appearance of the beads broke the last of Kariuki's composure. He remembered that night with a clarity he had tried to drown in cynicism. The argument between his parents, the way his mother had grabbed her keys, and the way he, a 12-year-old boy filled with a sudden, inexplicable anger, had shouted that he hoped she never came back. He had been the last person to speak to her, his words a curse that had seemingly been answered by the rain-slicked roads and the treacherous bend in the road near the bridge. He had never told anyone about those final words, not even Wanjiku, and he had spent 5 years mocking the world to keep from hearing the echo of his own voice. Now, the bead sat in his palm, a physical manifestation of his guilt, cold and accusing. The bird on the roof let out a sharp, clicking sound, like a judge's gavel hitting a bench. It was no longer just bringing back objects. It was reconstructing the crime scene of their lives. Kariuki looked at the beads and then at the ceiling, his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. The slow build of the haunting had reached a plateau of unbearable reality. The bird knew the secret he had buried deepest, and it was now draped around his neck like a noose. Driven by a sudden, frantic need to end the nightmare, Kariuki waited until his father had fallen into a heavy, medicated sleep, and Wanjiku was huddled under her blankets. He took the longest, sharpest kitchen knife from the drawer, the one his father used for the Sunday roast in better times, and stepped out into the moonlit yard. The air was unnaturally still, the usual township dog silenced by the presence of the predator on the roof. Kariuki felt a strange, cold clarity as he approached the side of the house. He didn't use a ladder. The bird was now so large that its bloated belly hung low over the eaves, within reach if he stood on a plastic crate. He could see the pulse of its veins beneath the translucent skin, a rhythmic throb that seemed to mock the fragility of human life. With a scream that was more a release of 5 years of suppressed agony than a battle cry, he lunged upward, driving the steel blade toward the creature's heart. He expected the resistance of flesh, the spray of blood, the end of the curse. Instead, the moment the tip of the knife touched the bird's skin, the laws of physics seemed to dissolve. The steel didn't pierce, it softened, the blade bending and curling like a strip of warm licorice. Kariuki watched in horror as the heavy metal warped around his hand, the handle becoming hot and malleable. The bird didn't even flinch. It looked down at him, its amber eyes wide and reflecting the moonlight, and let out a sound that froze Kariuki's blood. It was the sound of a newborn baby crying, a high-pitched, thin wail that carried the primal weight of total vulnerability and absolute need. The sound was so jarringly human, so filled with a sense of abandoned innocence, that Kariuki dropped the ruined knife and fell to his knees, covering his ears. The bird wasn't a monster that could be killed with a weapon. It was an emotional entity, a physical shadow of a wound that hadn't healed. The knife had refused to kill it because you cannot kill grief with violence, and you cannot cut your way out of a lie. He lay in the dust of the dying garden, the sound of the newborn's cry echoing through the township, realizing that the witch hadn't sent a monster to kill them, but a mirror to show them they were already dead. The crying didn't stop. For the next 24 hours, the bird on the roof emitted the relentless, soul-shattering wail of an infant, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled directly into the marrow of the family's bones. It was the sound of the life that had been lost, the potential that had been snuffed out, and the childhood that Kariuki and Wanjiku had been forced to abandon the moment their mother's heart stopped. The neighbors, driven to the edge of madness by the sound, stayed indoors, bolting their doors and windows against the auditory assault. The township felt like a ghost town, the only sign of life the rhythmic, sobbing cry that seemed to pulse from the very center of the Kariuki's home. Inside, the family had reached a state of sensory overload. Wanjiku sat in the corner of the kitchen, rocking back and forth in sync with the birds' cries, her eyes vacant. Mwangi had moved from the sofa to the floor, his head buried in his arms, his body shaking with silent, dry heaves. The bird had stripped away their last defenses. There was no more mockery, no more silence, only the raw, unadulterated sound of pain. Kariuki wandered through the rooms like a man in a trance, the crying filling every void in his mind. He realized that the bird was growing larger with every minute of the crying, its body now almost entirely covering the roof, its hair tangling with the television antenna and the electrical wires. The house was being consumed by the manifestation of their sorrow. He looked at the ruined knife on the floor, the gold ring in the saucer, and the red beads on the table. The slow build of the curse had reached its peak. The bird was no longer an external threat, it was an internal collapse. The crying fowl was a herald of the final stage, the stage where the secrets would have to be spoken or they would be crushed by the weight of the messenger. Kariuki felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over him. He knew that the crying wouldn't stop until he opened his mouth and let out the words that had been rotting in his chest for 5 years. The bird wasn't asking for a sacrifice of blood. It was asking for a sacrifice of pride. As the sun began to set on the 12th day, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, Kariuki walked toward his father and sister, the crying of the bird reaching a crescendo that shook the very glass in the frames. The newborn's wail on the roof shifted, curdling into something far more specific and devastating as the 13th night bled into the early hours of Wednesday. Mwangi, who had been a hollowed-out shell of a man for days, suddenly bolted upright on the floor, his eyes wild and fixated on the sagging ceiling. The bird's beak was open, and from between those clicking human teeth came a sound that didn't just mimic a voice. It carried the very soul of the woman they had lost. It was the low, melodic hum of Kariuki's mother, Mary, singing a Kikuyu lullaby about the harvest, a song she used to sing while stirring the ugali or while hanging the heavy, wet laundry in the afternoon sun. But the song was interrupted by a sharp, panicked intake of breath, and then her voice spoke, clear and resonant, filling the cramped living room. Mwangi, why didn't you listen? The rain is too heavy and the bridge is gone. The air in the room turned freezing, the moisture of their own breath visible in the dim light of the single flickering bulb. It was the sound of her final phone call, the one Mwangi had ignored because he was too angry to answer, too steeped in the pride of their final argument to offer the grace of a listening ear. The bird wasn't just haunting them. It was replaying the tragedy in real time, forcing them to inhabit the very moment the family had shattered, the teeth on the roof gnashing in time with the rhythm of her desperate, ghostly words. Mwangi began to claw at the floorboards, his fingernails drawing blood from the old wood as he let out a sound that was half prayer, half shriek. The weight of the bird above them seemed to double, the iron sheets screaming as the rivets began to pop like gunshots, one by one, letting in the smell of the wet, ozone-heavy night. "I'm sorry, Mary, I'm sorry," he cried, his voice breaking against the relentless broadcast from the roof. Kariuki watched his father's total dissolution with a mixture of horror and a strange, cold clarity. He realized that the bird was a bridge, a grotesque umbilical cord connecting their living hell to the unresolved purgatory of their mother's death. The creature's belly was now so low it touched the top of the refrigerator, its translucent skin pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly light that revealed the silhouettes of more objects waiting to be laid, more remnants of their buried shame. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a throat, and they were being swallowed by the voice of a woman who had been silenced by a car crash, but was now being given a second, monstrous life by their own refusal to mourn. The birds' teeth clicked faster, a frantic, industrial sound that mimicked the ticking of a clock counting down to the final collapse of their sanity. On the 14th day, when the township had completely retreated into a terrified, prayerful distance, Mama Shiro appeared at the gate. She didn't walk so much as glide through the gray ash of the dead garden, her tattered shawl trailing behind her like the wings of a grounded moth. She looked up at the roof, where the creature had now grown into a mass of poolsing, featherless flesh that obscured the entire structure of the house, and she didn't show a hint of fear. Kariuki met her at the door, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken into his skull. He looked at the woman he had mocked, the witch of the Githurai market, and saw not a villain but a custodian of a terrible truth. She reached out a hand, her skin like ancient parchment, and touched the warped metal of the doorframe. "It is a heavy guest you have invited, young one," she said, her voice a dry whisper that somehow carried over the bird's constant, low-frequency hum. "You thought you were laughing at a bird, but you were laughing at the weight of your own shadow. This creature is not made of magic. It is made of the things you were too small to carry. It is love that has been left to rot in the dark, and now it has grown teeth so that it might finally be heard." The community watched from behind their curtains as Mama Shiro stepped over the threshold, the very air in the house seemingly parting for her. She ignored Mwanga's sobbing form and went straight to the kitchen table, where the wedding ring and the funeral beads lay in their pools of dark ichor. She picked up the beads, letting them trail through her fingers like a rosary. "The curse is not the bird, Kariuki," she said, turning her milky eyes toward him. "The curse is the silence you used to protect your pride. You hated your sister because she looks like the woman you think you killed. You mocked me because you wanted to feel powerful in a world that took your mother away without asking permission. But the earth is tired of holding your secrets." She explained that the bird was a thahu, a spiritual uncleanness that had taken physical form, because the family's bonds had become so brittle they could no longer support the weight of the truth. The bird would continue to grow, she warned, until it either crushed them or until they fed it the only thing it truly hungered for, the confession of the lie that had torn them apart on that rainy night 5 years ago. She left as quickly as she had arrived, leaving behind a scent of sage and the terrifying realization that the monster on the roof was not their enemy, but their only chance at a reckoning. By the 15th day, the house had become an organ of silence, a biological extension of the monster on the roof. The walls seemed to breathe, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal veins of dark mold that pulsed in time with the bird's heart. Kariuki noticed that they no longer spoke to one another with words. They communicated through the bird. When Wanjiku was hungry, the bird would let out a low, hollow whistle. When Mwangi was gripped by a fresh wave of suicidal guilt, the bird's teeth would chatter until the windows rattled in their frames. The architecture of the home was being reconfigured into a prison of the psyche, where every thought was mirrored by a sound or a movement from the creature above. Kariuki felt a terrifying intimacy with the monster. He could feel the texture of its skin in his own dreams, a cold, leathery expanse that tasted of salt and old blood. He spent the day watching the shadow of the bird move across the floor, a slow, predatory sundial that marked the erosion of their lives. He realized then that the teeth weren't just for show. They were the hard, biting words they had flung at each other in the wake of the funeral, the "I hate yous," and the "it's your faults" that had never been taken back. This anatomy of silence was a physical weight that made every movement an agonizing chore. Kariuki tried to lift a glass of water, but his arm felt as though it were made of lead, anchored by the psychic gravity of the creature. He looked at Wanjiku, who was sitting on the floor drawing circles in the gray ash that had drifted in through the broken window. She looked like a changeling, her childhood stolen, and replaced by a hollow, watchful ancientness. The bird was integrating itself into their very DNA, its influence moving from the roof into their bloodstreams. Kariuki understood that they were being digested, not in a stomach of acid, but in a stomach of memory. The bird was breaking down their identities, stripping away the layers of denial and the masks of daily survival until only the raw, throbbing core of their trauma remained. He saw the human teeth of the bird in a new light. They were a reminder that the monster was a human creation, a Frankenstein's monster built from the scraps of a broken family. If they didn't speak soon, the integration would be complete, and they would become nothing more than permanent, silent fixtures in the bird's grotesque nest. The 16th night brought the storm that Githurai had been fearing. The sky over the highlands turned a bruised, electric purple, and the rain began to fall not in drops but in sheets of liquid iron. Inside the house, the situation reached its lethal climax. Wanjiku collapsed, her body burning with a fever that seemed to radiate from the bird above. Every time the bird let out a cry, her small frame would convulse, her eyes rolling back to show only the whites. Kariuki held her, feeling the unnatural heat of her skin, and realized that the bird was drawing its final energy from the youngest and most vulnerable among them. The roof was now bowing so low that the iron sheets were touching the top of their heads, the weight of the rain, and the monster threatening to flatten the house into the red mud. Mwangi was catatonic, his hands over his ears, humming a dissonant tone to drown out the sounds of the mother's voice that the bird was now screaming at full volume. It was a symphony of destruction, a cacophony of thunder, metal fatigue, and ghostly accusations that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality. Kariuki looked at his sister's face, pale and glistening with sweat, and something in him finally snapped. The mockery, the cynicism, the cool detachment he had used as a shield for 5 years, it all evaporated in the heat of her fever. He felt a surge of protective love so powerful it was painful, a sensation he had suppressed since the night the police came to the door. He realized that by hating his sister for surviving, by mocking her for her grief, he had been the one feeding the bird. He had been the one providing the human teeth with their bite. The neighborhood's final assault began as a group of men, driven by a mixture of fear and religious fervor, began to throw Molotov cocktails at the house, hopping to burn the demon away. The flames licked at the damp, leathery skin of the bird, but the creature didn't burn. It breathed in the fire, growing even larger, its translucent skin turning a fiery, incandescent orange. The house was a pressure cooker of fire, water, and ghosts, and Kariuki knew that the next few minutes would either be their salvation or their tomb. He stood up, pulling Wanjiku into his arms and dragging his father toward the back door, toward the garden of ash where the final reckoning awaited. They stumbled out into the torrential rain, 3 broken figures standing in a landscape of gray soot and charred plants. The bird on the roof followed them with its eyes, its massive head swiveling with a sickening, wet sound as it leaned over the gutter. The creature was now the size of a small bus, its wings draped over the sides of the house like the heavy curtains of a theater. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the rows of human teeth that were now bared in a silent, expectant snarl. Mama Shiro's words echoed in Kariuki's mind. The only way to stop it is to feed it the truth. He stood in the center of the dead garden, the mud clinging to his shins, and looked up at the monster. "You want it," he screamed over the roar of the wind. "You want the reason I've been a ghost in my own skin. You want the lie that turned us into this." The bird went suddenly, terrifyingly silent. The rain seemed to slow in midair, the thunder receding into a dull, distant throb. The world held its breath, as the boy prepared to exhume the body of his own shame. Wanjiku leaned against her father, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, while Mwangi looked at his son with the eyes of a man seeing a stranger for the first time. Kariuki felt the weight of the bird's gaze like a physical hand on his chest. He realized that this wasn't just about the words he was about to say. It was about the dissolution of the Kariuki he had invented to survive. To speak the truth was to kill the boy he had become and to invite back the boy he had been, the vulnerable, terrified 12-year-old who just wanted his mother to come home. The bird's teeth clicked once, a sharp, impatient sound, like a judge prompting a witness. The garden of ash was the courtroom, the storm was the jury, and his family was the audience. Kariuki closed his eyes, the scent of the funeral beads in his pocket filling his nostrils, and began to speak into the heart of the storm, his voice small but steady, cutting through the darkness with the sharp edge of a long-overdue honesty. I lied, Kariuki's voice cracked through the silence of the stalled storm. The night Mom left, I didn't just tell her I hoped she never came back. I followed her to the car. I stood in the driveway and I threw a stone, that heavy decorative rock she liked from the coast. I threw it at the back window because I was angry that she was leaving Dad, angry that everything was falling apart. He was sobbing now, the tears mixing with the rain on his face. I hit the glass. It didn't break, but it scared her. She looked at me through the rearview mirror and she was crying so hard she couldn't see the road. I saw the fear in her eyes, fear of me. And when she drove away, she was shaking because of what I did. I didn't just wish her dead. I sent her into that storm with a heart full of terror. The confession hung in the air, a heavy, jagged thing. Mwangi's face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The secret of the stone, a detail the police had missed, attributing the scratches to the accident, finally coming to light. The bird on the roof reacted violently. It let out a sound that wasn't a cry or a crow, but a deep, resonant bell-like tone that shook the earth beneath their feet. The translucent skin began to crack, and instead of blood, a brilliant, blinding white light began to leak from the fissures. Kariuki didn't stop. I hated you, Shiku, because you were the only one she smiled for that night. I hated you because I was the monster in her mirror, and you were the angel in her locket. I mocked you to make you as small as I felt. I mocked the old woman in the market because I wanted to see someone else be the victim for once. As the words poured out of him, the human teeth of the bird began to fall out, one by one, hitting the iron roof with the sound of hailstones. They weren't teeth at all. As they hit the ground, they dissolved into white flower petals, the first signs of life the garden had seen in a week. The bird's monstrous form was beginning to collapse inward, the weight of the lie no longer there to sustain its massive, grotesque anatomy. Mwangi stepped forward, his own voice joining the fray, his words a lower, more resonant frequency of pain. I knew about the stone. Kariuki, he whispered, his hand reaching out to touch his son's shoulder. I found it in the grass the next morning. I hid it. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just building a wall between us. I let you believe you were alone in your guilt because I couldn't face my own, that I had driven her to that car in the first place. The father and son stood in the rain, the shared secret finally out in the open, no longer a weapon but a bridge. The bird was now a swirling vortex of light and shadow, its wings dissolving into the mist. Wanjiku, her fever breaking, stood between them, her small hands reaching out to grab both of theirs. The hatred that had been the foundation of their home for 5 years was being washed away by the very rain that had once been a symbol of their destruction. The love-wearing fear that Mama Shiro had described was shedding its terrifying skin, revealing the raw, aching love that had been there all along. The dissolution of their hate was a physical experience, a feeling of lightened burdens and cleared lungs. The air in the township seemed to rush back into the yard, carrying the scents of the neighboring kitchens, charcoal, kale, and life. The bird's voice, which had been a cacophony of ghosts, merged into a single, soft note, the sound of their mother's real voice, not a mimicry but a memory. "It's okay," the wind seemed to whisper through the remaining stalks of the garden. "It's finally okay." The monster on the roof was now nothing more than a faint outline, a ghost of a curse that had been fed its fill of truth. The family stood in a circle, their hands locked tight, a 3-person fortress that was no longer built on silence. The witch's chicken had done its job. It had been the catalyst for a surgery of the soul, a brutal but necessary extraction of the rot that would have eventually killed them all. As the final words of confession were spoken, the bird on the roof didn't just disappear, it burst. The explosion was silent, a shockwave of pure, golden light that swept across the township, momentarily turning night into day. In the space where the monster had sat, there was no longer a sagging roof or warped iron. The house stood restored, the yellow paint gleaming as if freshly applied. And there, standing on the peak of the roof for a fleeting, beautiful second, was the silhouette of their mother. She wasn't a bird or a ghost with human teeth. She was radiant, her hair braided perfectly, wearing the red glass beads and the gold ring. She looked down at her husband and her children, her smile wide and genuine, a look of profound peace that Kariuki hadn't seen since he was a small boy. She raised a hand in a silent blessing, her spirit whispering a final message that resonated in their hearts. Love saved what mockery almost destroyed. Then, like a mist caught in a sudden breeze, she dissolved into 1,000 sparkling motes of light that drifted down onto the garden. By morning, the ash was gone. In its place, the shamba had exploded into an impossible overnight bloom of green. The kale was thick and vibrant, the maize stalks were tall and strong, and the rose bush Wanjiku had tried to save was covered in deep red blossoms that smelled of home. Kariuki walked through the market a week later, his head held high but his eyes humble. He found Mama Shiro in her usual corner, holding a perfectly normal, feathered chicken in her lap. He didn't laugh. He stopped, bowed his head in a gesture of deep respect, and placed a bag of the finest maize from their garden at her feet. She looked up at him and winked, a knowing, ancient glint in her eyes. The boy who had mocked the world was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that the world was far deeper and more dangerous than a sharp tongue could ever handle. He returned home to a house where the windows were open, the silence was filled with music, and the only thing on the roof was the gentle, rhythmic patter of a life being lived in the light. The truth doesn't just come out, it bites. If you felt the shadow of the crying fowl, share this with someone who keeps secrets and subscribe to Tales and Shadows for the full journey. Remember, in this township, laughter always has a price.